Air Force One is on the ground in Beijing, and every phone on that plane, every personal device belonging to every American official, every executive, every aide, had to be left behind before landing. That's not a protocol. That's a declaration, a statement of just how much the United States distrusts the country its president just flew into for the most consequential diplomatic meeting of 2026. Trump is in China. The summit is real. And nobody, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in the markets, knows what comes out of it. President Donald Trump's Air Force One delegation touched down at Beijing Capital International Airport at approximately 7:51 a.m. Eastern Time on May 13, 2026. The plane taxied for 8 minutes. Then the doors opened. Trump deplaned at 8:08 a.m. Eastern, greeted by Chinese Vice President Han Zheng and U.S. Ambassador to China David Perdue, stepping onto a red carpet surrounded by Chinese youth in a ceremony Beijing clearly choreographed for maximum optics. This is a summit that comes loaded with weight on every side. Trade disputes that have rattled global supply chains, Taiwan, the island at the center of the most dangerous military flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific. Questions about China's continued support for Russia in the Ukraine war. And underneath all of it, a deeper, harder question about which of these two men walks away looking stronger. If you want fast, grounded coverage of this story without the spin, subscribe right now, because this summit is moving in real time, and the next few hours could reshape a lot. Let's put the pieces together clearly, because the lead up to this landing was as significant as the landing itself. Before the plane even touched Chinese soil, administration officials were already operating under what's being described as a digital lockdown, traveling with stripped-down devices and temporary laptops, on the assumption that anything brought into China could be electronically compromised. Think about what that means for a moment. This isn't a precaution taken lightly. U.S. intelligence has for years assessed China as one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage actors on the planet. The decision to essentially sanitize the entire delegation's digital footprint before entering Beijing tells you exactly what American security officials think happens the moment a device crosses into Chinese airspace. And it wasn't just government officials under that lockdown. Trump confirmed that Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang had a seat on Air Force One for this trip, refuting an earlier report that suggested otherwise. Huang leads the world's most valuable company, currently valued at $5.3 trillion, Nvidia, the company at the absolute center of the global artificial intelligence arms race, the company whose chips China has desperately tried to access, and which the U.S. has spent the last several years restricting through export controls designed to prevent Beijing from gaining AI computing superiority. Jensen Huang on Air Force One, bound for Beijing. That single fact tells you this summit isn't just about tariffs and diplomatic pleasantries. The stated agenda includes talks on Taiwan, trade, Iran, and China's ongoing support for Russia in the Ukraine conflict. That's an extraordinary range of pressure points packed into a single diplomatic visit. Each one of those topics, on its own, would be considered a major diplomatic undertaking. All four together in one room between two leaders whose countries are fundamentally competing for dominance in the coming decades. That's something different entirely. The red carpet reception in Beijing was ceremonial by design. Beijing doesn't do unplanned optics. The youth welcoming delegations, the choreographed greeting from Vice President Han Zheng, all of it signaled that China wants the world to see this meeting as a moment of restored dialogue. Whether that dialogue leads anywhere is a separate question. What's confirmed is this. Trump is in Beijing. Xi is waiting. The topics on the table could not be more consequential. And the outcome, whatever it is, will be felt far beyond the walls of whatever stateroom they sit down in. The one thing nobody can confirm yet is what, if anything, either side is prepared to actually give. Here's what the cameras didn't show you. The moment those stripped-down laptops were handed out to American officials, each one already assumed to be compromised the second it connects to a Chinese network. That's the environment Trump is negotiating in. To understand why this summit carries the weight it does, you have to understand the architecture of what's broken between Washington and Beijing, and how much worse it could still get. Start with trade. The United States and China have the two largest economies on Earth. They are also, by most credible assessments, locked in a structural competition that goes well beyond import taxes. The tariff battles of recent years, waves of duties, retaliations, exemptions, threats, have already rewired portions of global supply chains. American manufacturers have moved production. Chinese factories have rerouted exports through third countries. The damage is real, measurable, and ongoing. And yet, after all of that disruption, U.S. and Chinese economies remain deeply intertwined. American consumers still buy products built on Chinese supply chains. China still holds significant portions of U.S. debt. The financial relationship is adversarial and codependent at the same time, a tension that no tariff negotiation has come close to resolving. Taiwan is a harder problem. Strategically, the island sits at the nexus of every major concern Washington has about Beijing's long-term ambitions. China has never formally renounced the use of force to bring Taiwan under its control. The U.S. has maintained a policy of deliberate strategic ambiguity on whether it would militarily defend the island, close enough to deter China without forcing an explicit commitment. That ambiguity has held for decades. Whether it holds through the next phase of U.S.-China relations is one of the defining open questions of this era. Do you think the summit produces a real deal on trade, or is it mostly theater? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. Then there's the Russia dimension. China's relationship with Moscow during the Ukraine conflict has been, in Western eyes, a quiet but consequential form of support, not battlefield weapons, by most public assessments, but economic lifelines, diplomatic cover, and technology flows that have kept Russia from being fully isolated. Washington has pressed Beijing on this repeatedly. Whether Trump pushes directly on this topic in Beijing and how Xi responds is one of the most closely watched unknowns of the entire visit. And underneath all of it sits the artificial intelligence competition. Nvidia's presence on this trip, the world's leading AI chip designer, accompanying the American president, is not subtle. U.S. export controls have tried to wall off China's access to the most advanced AI semiconductors. China has accelerated its own domestic chip development in response. Whatever is or isn't said about chips in these meetings, the industry watching most closely is the technology sector, which understands that AI compute supremacy is the next major axis of great power competition. The contradiction at the heart of this summit? Both sides need this meeting to appear productive. Neither side wants to be seen as having conceded anything real. Here's the detail that cuts through the ceremony. Trump's delegation traveled with stripped-down devices and temporary laptops, operating on the assumption that anything brought into China could be compromised. That means American officials conducting diplomacy in Beijing are doing so inside a communications environment they fundamentally do not trust. That's not two countries talking. That's one country walking into the other country's house while fully expecting to be listened to. And the CEO of the company whose chips define the global AI race was on the plane. Whatever conversations happen behind closed doors in Beijing, Washington's own security services are already assuming Beijing may hear them. Step back from the geopolitics for a moment, because the decisions made in Beijing over the next few days land very differently depending on where you are standing. If you work in American manufacturing, in Ohio steel, in Texas energy, in California agriculture, trade policy with China is not an abstraction. It is the margin between your operation running and not running. When tariffs go up, Chinese buyers walk away from American soybeans and find suppliers in Brazil. When tariffs come down, domestic producers who restructured around protections suddenly face competition again. Every round of U.S. China negotiations has produced winners and losers in American communities that never sent anyone to Beijing. This summit will too. If you work in technology, in semiconductors, in AI research, in cloud computing, the stakes of this meeting are existential in a different sense. The export controls placed on advanced chips were designed to preserve American technological leadership. But they've also created a paradox, pushing China to accelerate its own domestic chip industry, potentially creating a future competitor that's no longer dependent on American technology at all. The Nvidia question hanging over this trip isn't whether Jensen Huang will strike a deal in Beijing. It's whether any framework emerges that allows the U.S. to compete economically with China while still containing the military applications of that technology. That is not a simple calculation. If you are in Taiwan, 23 million people on an island 110 miles off the Chinese coast, you watch every U.S. China summit with a particular kind of attention. Not to what the leaders say publicly, but to what they don't say. Any signal, however indirect, that Washington's commitment to Taiwan's security is a negotiable variable is felt immediately. In Taipei, people understand better than most that great power diplomacy sometimes solves one problem by creating a quieter agreement on another. And if you are somewhere in the middle of the American economy, watching your 401k react to trade headlines, watching the price of electronics shift based on tariff decisions, watching news about a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait with a vague background anxiety, you are also in this story, just less visibly. The red carpet in Beijing looks like a diplomatic moment, but it is also, in the most direct sense, an economic negotiation with consequences for ordinary people on multiple continents. None of them are in the room. What makes this particular summit psychologically different from previous rounds of U.S.-China dialogue is the ambiguity around intent. Both Trump and Xi are leaders who have demonstrated a willingness to use diplomacy as performance as much as process. Past summits produced announcements that dissolved quietly in the months that followed, agreements that weren't agreements, truces that weren't truces. There is a reasonable case to be made that the very fact of this meeting is the message, each side signaling to domestic audiences and to allies that it remains capable of managing the relationship. The actual content may be secondary, but there are things that cannot be faked. Market movements after any announcement, semiconductor trade flows, military posture in the Pacific. Those will be the real scorecard. When this meeting ends, 3 things will happen simultaneously, and none of them will wait. Markets will react, immediately, globally, and not always rationally, to whatever framing comes out of the official readouts. Taiwan will assess every word of the joint statement for what it implies about American commitment, and American allies across Asia and Europe will begin recalibrating. Because a U.S.-China deal on trade almost always creates friction somewhere else in the alliance network. The most dangerous outcome isn't a breakdown. A breakdown would at least be clear. The most dangerous outcome is an agreement vague enough to be read differently by both sides, one that buys time without resolving anything, while both governments declare success. Zoom out far enough, and this summit is a data point in a longer arc. For the past several decades, U.S. foreign policy operated on a foundational assumption that integrating China into the global economic system would, over time, nudge it toward political liberalization and make it a stable stakeholder in the international order. That assumption is now broadly considered to have been wrong, or at least incomplete. China integrated into the global economy and became more capable, more assertive, and more willing to challenge that order rather than uphold it. The question now isn't whether the US and China are in competition. That's settled. The question is what kind of competition, managed by what rules, with what guardrails against miscalculation. This summit happens at a moment when those guardrails are thinner than they've been in years. Military-to-military communication channels. The lines designed to prevent an accidental confrontation in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait from spiraling into something catastrophic have been inconsistent. Intelligence assessments of Chinese military timelines around Taiwan have shifted. The technology competition has accelerated in ways that neither side fully controls. And into that environment walks a sitting American president on a red carpet in Beijing with the CEO of the world's most consequential chip company on his plane. What does intelligence want to know coming out of this meeting? Not the public statement, the private signals. Whether Xi made any concrete movement on Russia, whether any quiet framework was discussed on Taiwan, whether the digital lockdown held, or whether, somewhere in the margins, something was learned about American negotiating positions before the talks even began. What should viewers watch in the days after this summit? Watch the Taiwan Strait. Watch semiconductor export policy. Watch whether any ceasefire language around Ukraine shifts in tone from Beijing. Those are the real indicators, not the handshakes and the flags. This summit is not a conclusion. It is a temperature reading, a calibration point in a relationship that neither country can walk away from and neither fully trusts. The red carpet rolls up, the cameras fade, and then, quietly, in the decisions that follow in the weeks ahead, we find out what actually happened in that room. This story is not over when the handshakes are done. The next moves, on Taiwan, on chips, on Russia, could come within days, and each one of them will tell us something the summit itself didn't. What do you think comes out of this? A real deal, a symbolic one, or something that looks like progress and isn't? Drop your read in the comments. I want to see what this audience is thinking. And subscribe now, because when the next development breaks, you'll want to already be here.